I can get on with whatever it is that my higher power wants me to get on with this. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to share the communication leaflet and I'm going to read it for you all. I don't know if any of you've seen it, but I imagine in this country it's about £2. And as you can see, mine's very well worn. I love this. I love this communication leaflet. I came across it quite early on in my coder journey, and I just think it's really, really simple the way that it talks about things. Right. So I think what I'm going to do is try and work out how you make it a bit bigger, and I'm going to read some bits of it. Okay, maybe I'm just going to read it. That seems like a bit more, that seems above my technology abilities. So, communication in recovery. Introduction. Being simple or verbal are two basic communication skills that we need to develop in recovery. We seldom think about it, but what we say to others and ourselves and how we say it has a profound impact on our lives. Our internal and external communication habits shape our thoughts, feelings, actions, and relationships. Literally everything we experience in life. Indeed, poor communication makes our lives needlessly complicated. Not speaking up for ourselves and expressing our feelings in an open, honest, and healthy manner keeps us trapped in our codependency, a disease that for many members is a disease of silence. This pamphlet suggests some of the ways we can free ourselves from our codependent communication patterns. We can develop a new awareness of our verbal habits and learn to make healthier choices about how we communicate with others and ourselves. What is healthy communication? Healthy communication is clear, concise, and honest. This is what I really like about this bit of literature. It's like it is clear, concise, and honest. Do you know what I mean? It's like already it's talking to me not only about how I externally communicate with people. It's talking to me about how I communicate with myself. So the words and the voices that I use to talk to myself. And it's like when I first came to Coda, I had no idea. I couldn't separate thoughts and feelings for a start off. You know, when I first came to meetings, it was that thing about I didn't know if it was something I was thinking or something I was feeling. And then to gradually find out that this critical voice that had been inside my head the whole of my life like was a thing, like, because I didn't know. It's like I'd just been experiencing this voice. I didn't realize that there were different ways of communicating with myself. And, you know, like I'll come on at the end to some of the, you know, at the end of this leaflet, it's got a really good section on how you can, what things that can help you to help me to develop healthier communication patterns. And it was from this leaflet that I started very slowly to do that. So healthy communication is clear, concise, honest. To improve our communication, we first need to know our hearts and our minds clearly. Codependents continuously need to ask, what do I think, feel, and need? You know, again, I remember reading this very early on in my recovery and being like, I actually don't know what I think, feel, and need at all. And it was one of the things that helped me come to that realization. Because again, I'd just been living in my head and it had been like a dangerous place to know, but I had been in so much denial that I didn't even really know that. Once we answer these crucial questions, we can empower ourselves to express our feelings openly, honestly, without being controlled by our fear of reactions of others. What causes codependent communication? Codependent communication is caused by one primary force, fear, and the need to control it. Fear is the great repressor of the human spirit and a hidden culprit behind many of our damaging beliefs about others and ourselves. Fear masquerades as truth and holds us in false belief that we are unworthy and others' reactions will destroy us. Our communication patterns often reflect our fear. For example, when we are with angry people, we may walk on eggshells. If this approach is a conscious choice of how to take care of ourselves, then that's okay. However, in some situations with angry people, we may discover that we have been habitually irresponsible or dishonest with ourselves and others using manipulative weasel words when we communicate. These are expressions such as "I'm not sure" when we are, or "maybe" when we know that it's definitely, or "I'm sorry" when we're really not, or "I guess" when we're not guessing at all. With any of the above expressions, we may or may not be aware of our true feelings. If we are aware but we are not being verbal and honest, then we are being controlled by our fear. If we are not aware of our true feelings, then such expressions may allow us to continue to stay in touch with those feelings. Weasel words, I love the fact that it's weasel words, and I think this is one of the things that I loved most about this leaflet when I came to it, was that up until this point, which was, as I say, very early on, because it was in my first home group, which was a women's meeting, it's like everything had been quite dry and sad, and I'd mainly cried in meetings or been angry. And the weasel words thing just was one of the first times I ever remember laughing in Coda and being like, oh, they really are weasel words, and imagining tiny weasels like not really saying what they meant. So weasel words often soften the blow of our feelings and opinions and allow us to hedge our bets and thereby control other people's reactions. In some cases, such expressions also allow us to avoid facing our own wants and desires and never know our true feelings. It's incredible to think about it, but it's possible to spend one's life saying, "I'm not sure, I don't know what to do," or "I've got mixed feelings." Sometimes we really may know what to do, or really have mixed feelings, and that's okay. However, we must be careful that we are being honest with ourselves. If we look clearly at the feelings and attitudes behind most codependent communication, we discover a host of fears: fear of commitment, fear of shame, a core belief in our own lack of worth, or others' anger and abandonment. The major problem with this unhealthy communication is that we dishonor ourselves. Every time we fail to honor our precious thoughts and feelings for the sake of pleasing others, we sell ourselves out as well. Our true selves may in pain or fury, or our true selves may be in pain or furious, but we walk around with plastic smiles on our faces. Right, I'm not going to read the rest of it. I'm just going to say that the rest of it talks about, go find it. I'll put the PDF link into the chat box in a little while. What it goes on to talk about here is doing a 4-step inventory of what happened, like of our communication history. So communication with our family, communication in the past and now. And what I'm going to share with you, which I do wish that I'd made some kind of power presentation, but it's really not my style right now. It may be at some point, which is an exciting thought. So that's what I'm going to, and then it talks about changing our codependent patterns. So that is eventually what I'm going to get on, what I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to talk about first is essentially what communication was like for me in my family of origin. Then I'm going to talk about how my communication was when I came into Coda. And then I'm going to talk about the actions that I've taken to change these communication patterns, which has taken a long time. It's been like water torture, but I do feel like I'm starting to get somewhere with it. I did some work on this on Wednesday, just gone, and I really upset me, because essentially what this step 4 has been about for me is about how I was emotionally, intellectually, and verbally abused as a child. I'm not going to go into it too much. Do you know what I mean? But it's like what happened on Wednesday was a really lovely spiritual experience for me, because what it showed me was that I was really able to hold myself, hold my inner child, and reparent myself, which is what I've learned here in Coda, and allow myself to really grieve that what happened as a child, and some of the things that I've done really in terms of communication. So when I was a kid in my house, it was very, I'm the eldest of two. My 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 dad's an alcoholic, rageaholic, sexaholic. My mum, I would say, is codependent. These are the things that I am saying about them after my experience of going through the steps. It was not unusual for me to be really, really, really raged at, shouted at, screamed at, and this is overt abuse and overt verbal abuse, and that's sad. But that is what, I thought that was the way that people, that I thought that was what was normal, because that's what I grew up with. I also suffered from covertly, because I watched my mother and my brother also being screamed at and being raged at and that kind of thing. I was called names as a child. I was always told that I was fat. I was always compared to my dad's sister, who, he hated, and he would say, "You're like Fat Pat." I was called other really, really horrible names, really, which no child should be called. There was always this comparing thing. Oh, you're like so and so, which would be somebody that my dad didn't like. And then on the other side, I would also be called like the warrior princess, Boudica, the capable one. You're not like your brother. You're the one that can do everything. So there were these very confused communications that came through from my family. And, it's no wonder that as a codependent adult, people pleasing, and I have a real fear of making mistakes. My resolution for 2023 was not to have any resolutions at all, was just to allow myself to make mistakes. And I'd like to tell you all that I've made a few mistakes already in this 4 weeks of this year, and I've been all right with it, because me and my higher power have been having a conversation about it. And me and my higher power have been looking after all my littles, and my teenager, who ferociously don't want to make mistakes. So there was a lot of ridicule, humiliation, and sarcasm in my house, when I was growing up. People won't be friends with you if they find out that you do X, Y, Z. If I got anything wrong, like I remember having to write an envelope and having to put block capitals on it and not being able to. I think I was probably below 7 years old, and my dad raging at me and, like humiliating me and telling me that I was never going to be able to write, and you're never going to amount to anything. All these things were communication patterns that I learned. I thought that was the way that you did communication. And just like being put down, being mocked, like intimate, not, what's the word, when you imitate someone, like when somebody says something and they go, or like copy the words that you're saying. All these things were things that were normal in my childhood. The idea that I wouldn't amount to everything, that I'll never change. One of the things that still my family will do, bless them, is like, oh, you used to be so beautiful when you were a child, which is, like always putting me down. And, I was talking to somebody recently about, do I ever remember, in doing this, it's kind of like, I don't ever remember being told that I was loved, or, which I'm not, it's like, That's so hard for little me, but it really makes a lot of sense of the way that I then grew into my codependency. And then the other thing that was really that part of this step 4 that I did around my communication patterns was like there was a lot of one-upmanship and one-downmanship in my family. So the one-upmanship would be that I learned that knowing more and being an expert was a really good thing. So I would be able to make myself feel better and not be in low self-esteem if I knew more. So it's like as I grew up, and from doing this kind of like step 4 of myself, it's like, well, actually, and correcting people, like, I think you'll find that's not right. Well, I wouldn't do it like that. And the poisonous in my family, it was like, you are like this, you make us do this, you do that. And, one of the things I've learned in fellowship is if somebody's pointing a finger at you, there's 3 pointing back at them, 1 at the solution. But, so there was a lot of this, giving advice all the time and gossiping within my family. The 4 of us were very isolated. My dad's family lived at one end of the country and my mum's family lived at the other end of the country, and my dad would constantly be like, well, they're weak because they do this, or so there was this always that we were better in some way. We could read books, so this communication, all these control communications of blaming and shaming all kind of piling up. And then the other way that I learned to one of the other things that I learned, ways that I learned to communicate, was a lot of one-downmanship. So self-pity, using self-pity and trauma and stories to manipulate people, uncontrollable crying, just as much as I would do uncontrollable raging. All of these things came from my childhood. And if I couldn't, in terms of my codependency, if I felt big emotions, my emotions always felt bigger than me when I first came to Coda. And these were the ways that I coped. These were the ways and as much as I was acting out in these ways, so using anger as a boundary, using silence as a boundary and not saying anything, or using too many words and being an expert as a boundary, all of these ways of communicating, they just kept everybody, the world at arm's length, and I became more and more isolated. Another way that, in terms of my family of origin, that I was controlled through communication was the idea of sides, um, and so you had to agree with my father, you had to agree with everything that he said. But that's what I took on. And when I became a grown-up, I remember when I first followed tradition 1, like realizing that the idea of unity, the whole of my life had been, if you're on my side, you agree with me, you think what I think, you say it the way that I want it to be said, and you do what I want to do, then we can have unity. There can be common welfare. And that was one of the things that came up in this step 4 that I did around my communications. And then some of the other things that came up were there was a lot of secrets and lying. It was like, as a child, I was told not to tell the truth. Actively don't tell those people. Don't, like when relatives or people came to visit, it would be like, stand by your bed, smile, don't tell anybody what's going on. Don't wash our dirty laundry in public, all of that kind of thing. And when I first came into the fellowships, talking and doing things like this I couldn't do, because I would immediately go into a shame attack because I tried communicating with someone. So all of this is, all of this stuff that happened to me on the outside, I then am starting to do on the inside to myself. So this, and it creates, especially around honesty. I have so much shame around honesty, being honest still sometimes. And the other thing that happened, there was loads of stuff about don't tell your father. Watching my mother and learning from my mother how to people please my father so he wouldn't rage. That it was not a covert way of me learning how to control, watching my mother people please my father and stepping around my mother. And I, often in relationships with men, particularly, even friendships, it's just kind of like I can get very scared by men and really want to placate them and sort of ask them how they are and ask lots of questions so I can seem really interested when I'm not. I'm just scared. So, my so these are all ways that I'm learning how to control. So I lost my thread a bit now. And then other things that were said in my family, for example, my dad is a rip roaring atheist. So from when I was very tiny, so from 6, I remember at the same time, when I was 6, my dad used to be not kind of like, you see what communication is like when you start looking at it. One of the things that he always used to say was, you're born, you die, you rot. And when you're 6, that's very scary. So not only am I kind of getting the idea that there isn't, my dad is the only higher power. What I'm also getting it is the fear put into me about the fact that, why are we here even? Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I presume that my dad always thought he was the one-eyed man, and I often would go into situations and think that I was the expert and the only one that knew something. Why you like this was something that often used to get shouted at me. We're always late because of you. It's your fault. Everybody's upset. There was always a lot of blame and shame. And when I started doing the more that I started writing down all this stuff, it's our secret, that's a thing that would make me feel really falsely empowered and very special. Little girls should be seen and not heard. So the thing was that all of these things kind of were communications that happened in my family. This is how it worked. One of the other things that happened in my family, which I think is always hilarious, and my children, so I've got 2 grown-up children, when they started to get to be teenagers, they would be completely what's the word? Amazed by my family of origin, because basically in order to have conversation, when we're all together, it's who can shout the loudest. That there's no kind of waiting for somebody to speak. Everybody just piles in, and it really is, if the louder you speak, the more that anybody listens to you. Survival of the fittest, I think one of my children used to describe it as. But they were always really wow, that's really amazing, isn't it, that they do that? So listening is definitely something that I never learned as a child. I really, really didn't. It wasn't part of the setup at all. So in doing this, the inventory of what happened to me as a child, what I then started to see was the way that I communicated. So when I came to Coda, blame and shame, which is one of the control patterns, was mainly the way that I went about life, and still can today. The one-upping and one-downing I still can do. And all the thing is about all of these things is they generally send me into, I know that I'm doing that, I'm in fear and terror, and that's why I'm doing them these days. And they're all a lot different. They really, really are. Is it really 8:25? That's amazing. That's nearly time to have a break, isn't it? And then when we get back, I'm going to talk about the things that I have used from this leaflet the following for healthier communication patterns and the way that my communication has changed and things that I've learned in Coda. So should we do that? So by doing a fourth step of how communication was in my family, I saw more clearly why I was never allowed to make any mistakes, why I was people pleasing, why I went from the extreme of rage, which is self-abandonment, to just being nice, being really passive aggressive and nice, and a lot of the things that are in the denial and the avoidance patterns. And basically abandoned myself, dishonored myself in my communication over and over again. And actually, I'm just going to go back to the other one and move it over a bit. And it says, how do we change our communication patterns? I mean, the first thing is to be aware of it, which is what any step four for me has done, is made me kind of like glaringly kind of like, oh shit, there's the thing, you know, that's where it came for. So it says on the leaflet, as the steps teachers, learning to change our codependent habits begins with with acceptance and a willingness to change, and then action. And for a long time in my program of codependency, I forgot the action bit. I really did. I was just kind of like, I'm a codependent, or used it as an excuse. We can't change what we don't know. Furthermore, all the insights in the world won't help unless we want to change and actually do it. As noted earlier, we can begin this process by working steps, but this time focusing specifically on our communication patterns. If we work all 12 steps in the light of our verbal communication habits, we discover how well each step can be applied to our communication history and patterns. The most important point to remember is that these patterns have been learned and they can be unlearned. Our verbal habits may have run our lives for years and protected us around unsafe people, but today we can let go of them and walk through the discomfort that comes with changing old behaviours. So I think one of the things is that there are some of the things that I have made amends, particularly to my children, around about the ways in which I communicated with them. So one of the main ways is that I used to shame them around their body and be like, you're fat, or you've lost weight, or, you know, why are you wearing that? Or, you know, just have opinions about them. And that's something that I don't do anymore. I have a bottom line that I might say, oh, you look lovely in that, or, oh, what a lovely jumper. But I would never, and I try not to. I'm, you know, like, I'm codependent. I'm always going to get it wrong. Yeah, you know, it's perfection. It's having a bash, not being perfect. But generally, those are some of the things that I've made amends with to my children around. I've also made amends for raging, and it's very rare these days that I do rage. I was really out of sorts last Sunday and raged at a woman in the park who asked me to pick up my dog poo when I was about to do it, and it just turned into a, you know, like immediately turned into her going, all right, don't get so upset, and me going, no, you don't get so upset. It's like immediately I go into any rage. It's like I'm a child again. I'm a teenager, and I'm like, no, it's your fault. No, it's you. Which I did have a laugh about, and I talked to my higher power about it, and I apologized to this woman. But generally, I don't. One of the gifts of my program is that I don't tend to get as the purple hot rage anymore. And I think that's because, you know, I'm more aware when I'm scared or when I'm in shame. So I'm going to go through the things that they suggest in this leaflet, and I'm going to talk about them because I've talked enough about the problem. So let's look at the solution. So the following suggestions help us to develop healthier communications pattern. Listen carefully to our own thoughts and feelings. So one of the gifts from my CODA recovery is that I now understand the difference between my thoughts and my feelings. I would say a lot of the time. Occasionally, it's not gonna happen because I'm codependent, it's a spiritual dilemma. I need to have a spiritual program for it and work every day with that. You know, the hardest one for me has been to separate shame and fear of shame from my feelings. And just before Christmas, I had a really big spiritual experience whilst I was working tradition 11, which is about not being in promotion, but being in attraction. So not selling myself. And I realized how much like how big the lake of toxic shame I had was. It was like I got to the viewing point and I all of a sudden was like, I can't do this on my own. And I felt like in that moment, I got my step one encoder properly. I was just like, I can't do this without my higher power. I have to talk to them all the time. So I do try, like generally, in order to help to listen to my thoughts and feelings, I journal, which is something that I refused to do when I first got here, but I find really, really, really helpful. One of the other things that I use, because often my thoughts can still be very, very critical, is that I learned from a workshop at the Arizona meeting about a way in which I could deal with my critical internal voice, which, like find out what it is that I'm saying to myself and then ask myself, is this true? Like, am I a fuckwit? Which is one of the things that I will constantly call myself. Is that true? No, it's not true. And then the next thing is, what would my higher power say? And for a long time, this was quite mirror signal maneuver, and I would have to write it down, and I did it. But this helped me to listen to my thoughts and feelings and listen to the abusive ones and to listen to the good ones and to kind of like be able to like reparent myself and just say, no, those ones aren't true. That's not how my higher power taught me. And this has also given me a lot of practice in talking, listening to the voice of my higher power, listening for what my higher power says to me, which also very mirror signal maneuver still can be on certain days if I've got a lot of emotions going on, or there's a lot of conflict going on, or there's just a lot going on, but these days that's become a lot easier. But I've had to put in actions, listening carefully to my own thoughts and feelings. One of the things that I do in outreach, which I've learned to do in Coda, is I always ask for no feedback, because if I get feedback, I'm not listening to my own thoughts and feelings. And it's because of all these voices, all the communication, all the things I've told you about my childhood. No feedback in outreach has been a real gift for me, so that I can really know what my thoughts and feelings are. Sometimes delay our immediate responses to questions, comments, to give ourselves time to think and feel. Like, what a gift. Pause. Just, it's like that in itself, that I could talk to you for hours about not doing something immediately. For me, the voice of my higher power is never immediate. It's never panicked. It's never I've got to. It's never I should. It's never, it's nothing rushed. It's like it's always considered and soft and gentle. And I've learned that here, and by going through the steps and the traditions, and by learning stuff from other people in fellowship, monitoring ourselves to weasel words as we speak. Now, one of the biggest weasel words that I would say is that I used to use is I'm sorry. And I still can, like when I got here, I wanted to apologize that I didn't have some fancy PowerPoint presentation. Do you know what? I just don't, you know. But you see, it's like I do that a lot, like that's another one of my big weasel words. Often I'll say to people, does that make sense? Which is like, please validate me and tell me that because I'm feeling a bit insecure about what I just said to you. That's another one that I use a lot. Um, yeah, but these days I really try not to say maybe, or if I need to break, like break a commitment, I'm kind of like, I don't immediately say, would you like to do it next week? Or I do say, would you like to do it next week? But I try to watch what I'm doing. Um, I guess is another one, or, all of those weasel words, which are just me expressing my low self-esteem and the shame that I feel. I have a lot of compassion for myself when I use weasel words as well. I like to think of weasels as like a bit of a power animal these days. Um, Prepare for difficult conversations ahead of time, yet be open for spontaneity. I mean, bookending, what a great thing. I remember when I first heard about bookending and knowing that I'm going to have a difficult conversation and calling somebody before and calling somebody after, praying before and praying after, journaling before and journaling after, doing outreach before if I needed to, and outreach afterwards, going for a walk before and afterwards if it's a very difficult conversation. All skills that I've learned in Coda. Use Coda or personal affirmations when we're feeling the codependent crazies. Yeah. I mean, I would say that the best £2 that I ever spent was the little affirmations book, which I really, really love. And I often carry it around in my bag so that I've got it during the day. There are various affirmations that I will say to myself if I'm in a shame spiral or a coda crazy or I'm thinking too much. And I'll just say, I am enough, I have enough over and again. I can receive love and offer love over and over again. I hated affirmations when I got here. I thought they were really hippyish and stupid. These days, I'm like, thank you, God. That's a really good idea. Let me have some of that. So note self-effacing language says I guess, I think, and I think, see, I've got over those, but I do a lot of that. And bless me, these days I'm way more compassionate with myself about it. And I'm like, yeah, I do those things. And I love myself for doing those things because that's showing me where I need to still take care of myself. Which I don't think of self-facing. I'm going to be doing this for the whole of my life, I hope. I don't feel like I'm going to get cured. I feel like I'm not. When I got here, I thought that I would be fixed by now, and I'm not. And I'm quite glad. And for me, one of the things that I really love is just to be that I can be gentle with myself when I make mistakes these days. That is a gift from my Coda program. And know that if we change our minds about previous decisions, we can verbalize our current thoughts if we need to. Changing your mind. Like, there was none of that in my childhood. It was like my um, my dad's word was law. I've never heard my dad say sorry. Everything he said was, this is the way that it is. And that was how I was. I was talking to my sponsor about all of this communication stuff this week. And just noticing how extreme my language can be, like, I'm going to leave this place. And, I love my sponsor because they never say anything without using I statements. And she told me her experience of about just waiting for things to naturally happen rather than thinking I have to decide what happens. Practice using different response words and expressions. For example, are we always fine? I mean, that's a great suggestion, isn't it? People often say, how are you? And sometimes I say, I don't say that I'm fine these days. I think I usually say a few, uh, you know, I'm feeling content, or I've got lots of emotions going on, or things are mainly good, and then there's this. But yeah, the way that I feel like I've just got a lighter touch when it comes to how are you these days. I don't, because that's the other thing that I can do is just go into a massive sort of like, sorry, I'm just laughing at my communication. I can go into a lot of explanation, over explaining things. I try not to do that as well. And I think I have learned that from doing the check-ins that we do at the beginning of meetings, 5 words or less. That's a very useful thing, to be given permission to do that in a meeting and to be listened to. So watch for bargaining patterns, for example. I can't do today, but I'll try tomorrow, when we know that tomorrow won't be any better. Or I can't do today, but I can do tomorrow. Especially in messages, I try to be a lot more. I can do this, but I can't do that. Not in a bargaining way, just in a definite, honest, concise way. Speak slowly, firmly, and clearly when drawing boundaries. I think the thing is about all communication that I found from the work that I've been doing over the last few weeks is that communication is all about boundaries for me. It, you know, I draw boundaries with my words internally and externally. So, I can tell myself inside when I'm criticizing myself, that's not a nice way to talk to yourself. You wouldn't talk to anybody else like that ever. And that's drawing a boundary with myself. I have boundaries around overthinking. So it's like we've thought about that for long enough now. So now we're going to turn it over to our higher power, which maybe that sounds a little bit, say, I want your validation, so I'm just going to move on. Avoid justifying or explaining ourselves, even when we feel the compulsion to do so, like I did then. I remember as a teenager, I hated going anywhere with my mum because she would tell the waiter her life story whilst ordering a bottle of water. And I think that is, the opposite of the disease of silence and just going on. Notice how words such as should or ought may be controlling us. I do this internally all the time. I should and I ought to have made a PowerPoint presentation. I didn't. My perfectionism always talks to me in that language, and I need to ask it not to, and then turn it over to my higher power, and that's what works for me. Note whether we are trying to control others with our words, tone, volume, or non-stop talk. I feel like I'm doing that now. Or if we allow others to control us with similar verbal tactics. Speak lovingly with ourselves and others and our higher power. And then it says, add your own personal patterns to this list. And I would just, for me, doing that and adding things that weren't on here, the guidelines for sharing. So one of my added things on here is, always use I statements. Don't give feedback. Always ask if you want to give feedback, or wait. Never give advice. Got hard bottom lines on that. I go over them all the time because you know what, I'm codependent, and I don't mean that in a excuses way. I just mean I'm trying my best, really am. And I think one of the other things that, so I've mentioned about that I do outreach with no feedback, that suits me better. Don't beat myself up when I've got it wrong. If I've got a list, let go of any I have to let go of any expectations or fantasies of how somebody is going to react if I talk to them. So any things like that, because, fantasies, when I got here, I thought were just positive things. For me, fantasies are always can be negative things, like catastrophizing, um, worrying, all of that. I need to hand it over to my higher power first of all, but like any expectation that I've got about how anybody's going to receive anything, it's a fantasy. I'm going to go to bed tonight knowing that I did this as service, and if somebody got something out of it, great, but I have no expectations that I will have cured anybody of their codependence by doing this. In the past, I might have done, because my grandiosity is large. And I think for me, having some bottom lines around some communication, so for and internally and externally. So I mentioned about the thinking thing. I have a lot of bottom lines around thinking. We're just not doing it. It's like sometimes I'm like, you've had 5 minutes, we're moving on now, and then going and doing something else, because I can make myself bonkers. Obsessions. We've had 5 minutes. We're going to do the serenity prayer and we're going to move on. So yeah, for me, around communication, being kind with myself, having some bottom lines and putting in action around it when I notice it, doing the step 4 has been really exciting, brought up a lot of grief to be healed. I've cried a lot, and I think it's been a really amazing thing, and I would highly recommend it. That's obviously not in an advice giving way. Anyway, I feel like I've talked a lot, so I'm going to let you guys share back or ask questions. I can't promise to answer any questions. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to me. It actually has been a pleasure. It really, really has. I think it's just so important how I talk to myself inside and out. And you know what? I've really, really, actually really. Oh, that's the only other thing that I was going to say. I was going to say the various bits in the book that I think are useful around communication. Then I will shut up. So I think for me, parts of the big book that have been useful, the Coda Big Book, that one with the lovely Teletubby sunshine on the front of it. The Child Within part, so rereading that has been helpful for me when I've been in a big communication fog. The reparenting ourselves part, I've used that a lot. The boundaries part, these are all in the frequently asked questions in chapter 5. And then there is also a section on what are non-physical and passive forms of abuse and control. And that is really, really, really useful. So it goes through a lot of the things that came out in my step 4. And thank you for listening to my kind of step 5. Love you, Coda family. Thank you, lovely. I think for me, one of the things that I tend to do is say what I'm feeling, how I'm feeling, using I statements. You know, I'm feeling whatever it is you're feeling. Does that make sense? See, I do that a lot. I think the other thing that I do is, if somebody is constantly going over my boundary, it's like boundaries have a consequence. So that might mean that I'm not that person, I don't go near that person anymore, really. I don't ask those things of that person because they can't respond to them. So they're not respecting me in any way. I have had conversations with people where I have said, I feel very defensive, because if somebody's being defensive with me, it usually makes I feel defensive as well. Fair. And some relationships just aren't equal and can't be. And that's okay, is what I found. Anyway, thank you for your question. And delaying answering people like that, sometimes pausing and going to God with it, thinking this is happening for me, not to me, not taking it personally, has been a gift for me in situations like that. Thank you, lovely. I try and be quiet, is what I try and do. I try and carve out space for myself and just do self-care. And, you know, if that's journaling, praying, walking, you know, you know, like once I'm in child, I've abandoned myself, is the way that I feel. And so then I need to do some just self-care, whatever that is, you know, whatever that looks like for you. You know, for me, I did this afternoon, I was very nervous, so I did a whole load of dancing to some things. You know, that's what my inner child like, my inner teenager likes doing, dancing. You know, I talk with my inners, my teenager, my children, whichever. You know, when I was really upset on Wednesday and walked my dog and was like crying and met a jogger coming in the other direction who just was, there was this woman like bubble snot crying out loud, and they were like, "Are you all right?" It was like, I really was, because internally I was looking after myself and saying, it's all right that you've got these emotions. That was sad. That wasn't nice, the way that happened. You don't have to do that anymore. You know, it's that thing about writing down what my higher power would say to me and then saying it to myself, which, you know, really, I'll stop talking. And I'll unmute you. Pleasure, lovely. And yeah, I was listening to a chair last Saturday in Coda, and one of the things that I heard and really took from it is that triggers are a real blessing, because it means something can then heal. And that I've like taken that with me throughout the week. Like, I've really been like, you're triggered. That's great. We're going to be able to heal this together, you know? I hear you and I identify with you. I recently visited my aunt, who I've been estranged from. And so this was the first time I'd seen her in like maybe 2 or 3 years at Christmas time. And she said to me, "Which car is your car?" And I said, "It's the yellow one over there. I bought it so people could play yellow car punch," which is a game in England. If you see a yellow car, you get to punch another person, which was a joke. And she went, "Oh, well, you haven't changed, have you?" And it's like, in that moment, I kind of just met it with humor and was like, "No, I haven't. It's really nice to see you. Thank you for saying that to me." And I didn't mean it with any front. I just didn't take it personally for whatever reason in that moment. It just like, I hear you. I can do that kind of thing as well. That's all I've got to say, really. I
Okay.
identify a lot, and I like the weasel behaviours. You see, it's weasels as like our animals here.